The gavel cracked like lightning through the chamber, but it wasn't the sound that froze the room. It was the interruption. A single, sharp voice slicing across Jasmine Crockett's words, halting her mid-sentence as if her presence had no weight. The chamber stilled. Every camera swiveled. Every eye fixed. For a heartbeat, silence hung like glass about to shatter. Crockett's lips parted, then closed. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her notes, but her face remained calm. The interruption wasn't just rude. It was a challenge. A dismissal. A declaration of power from Clarence Thomas, accustomed to commanding the silence of others. Whispers began to stir, faint at first, then louder, like a current running through the room. The disrespect was undeniable, but so was the danger. Crockett stood at the edge of a moment that could tilt her into irrelevance, or into history. She drew a slow breath. The chamber waited. "Congresswoman, you will stop there." The words were curt, clipped, and heavy with arrogance. Gasps. A shifting of chairs. Some leaned forward as if to catch every syllable. Others leaned back, uneasy. The air itself felt metallic, vibrating with tension. Crockett did not flinch. Her calm was deliberate, her silence sharper than any retort. Every camera froze on her face. The interruption had been meant to silence her, yet now the focus burned hotter, brighter, unrelenting. The arrogance of dismissal had exposed itself under the lights. A pulse of outrage beat through the chamber. The room seemed to lean toward her, as though waiting for the inevitable spark. Her composure carried weight, the weight of restraint before fire. The silence cracked like glass. A storm was gathering. But what no one in the chamber knew, the real storm was only beginning. The chamber wasn't just filled with officials, it was filled with years of distrust, history, and a country on edge. Every polished desk and velvet chair carried echoes of past battles. The walls themselves seemed to breathe the weight of scandal, decisions, betrayals, and whispered deals. Tonight, all of that history pressed down on a single moment. America's trust in its highest institutions was already fragile. Court rulings had divided communities. Investigations had cracked confidence. The very idea of the rule of law trembled under the weight of partisanship and power plays. This chamber was not just a room. It was a battlefield disguised as marble halls. A hush stretched longer than law itself. Eyes darted like searchlights, hunting for weakness, scanning for defiance. Every microphone felt like a weapon, one word away from striking a blow that could ripple across the nation. And when Clarence Thomas's voice cut through, it wasn't simply a procedural interruption. It was a show of power. A reminder that hierarchy still reigned. But the stakes stretched far beyond that night. Across the country, people watched their screens with clenched fists, wondering if this was yet another moment when arrogance would eclipse accountability. Political commentators had already drawn their battle lines. Allies whispered of injustice. Critics warned of chaos. Citizens asked, quietly but urgently, if dignity still had a place in power. The interruption was more than a breach of decorum. It was a warning shot. The arrogance of silencing a rising voice revealed how fragile democracy can feel when those entrusted to protect it seem eager to dismiss it. The nation was not simply watching a debate. It was watching a stress test on the very fabric of legitimacy. For Jasmine Crockett, the chamber became an arena. Every pause carried danger. Every glance threatened dismissal. Yet she stood as the lone figure willing to meet arrogance with resolve. She had no army at her back, no decades of institutional weight. She had only her words. The silence in that chamber wasn't emptiness. It was expectation. A coiled tension, waiting for release. A single response could shift perception, redraw power, and restore dignity where it had been bruised. That was the magnitude of the stakes. And into this powder keg walked Jasmine Crockett, carrying nothing but her words. Clarence Thomas didn't build his power overnight, he built it in shadows, controversy, and silence. From the earliest days of his career, he learned that restraint could be more dangerous than thunder. A pause could bend a room. A silence could erase a question. and a single gavel of authority could drown an entire chorus of dissent. He rose through the ranks not as a firebrand but as a fixture, each step marked by careful calculation. His presence on the bench was not defined by the number of words spoken but by the weight they carried when he chose to break silence. Power lingered in his pauses. Every word weighed like a gavel. Critics whispered, allies looked away. But with power came controversy. Investigations. Accusations of ethical lapses. Questions about impartiality that never quite vanished. Yet each time the storm gathered, Thomas seemed to wait it out. He would sit still, unshaken, as if the noise of the world could never penetrate his armor of silence. To his critics, this calm was arrogance, an indifference to accountability. To his defenders, it was discipline. Either way, the pattern was clear. He endured by refusing to bend, by letting outrage collapse under its own exhaustion. This silence became his weapon. In hearings, his refusal to speak was interpreted as untouchable confidence. In chambers, his sudden interjections carried the weight of a hammer strike. To those beneath him, the message was unmistakable. He spoke when it mattered, and when he spoke, others stopped. So when Jasmine Crockett stood that night, her words measured, her resolve unshaken, Thomas's interruption was not a fluke. It was part of a history, a man used to silencing others before they grew too powerful. He had spent decades perfecting the art of dismissal, disguising arrogance as authority. His voice was not just an objection. It was a warning, a reminder of hierarchy. Yet times had changed. The cameras now cut sharper. The microphones carried further. Public patience had thinned. Silence no longer guaranteed safety. Instead, it sparked suspicion. Each pause, once powerful, now carried the echo of questions unanswered. Every word weighed like a gavel, yes, but the people had begun to ask, whose justice did it serve? The interruption of Crockett carried all that history. It was not only one moment of arrogance. It was the embodiment of a pattern, a man wielding silence as power, and breaking it only to remind others of their place. But the chamber, and the nation beyond, had grown restless. The old strategies were losing their grip. On this night, Clarence Thomas tried to wield the silence once more. But silence, on this night, would no longer belong to him. Jasmine Crockett never walked into politics for comfort, she walked in to fight. From the beginning, her life was marked not by privilege but by persistence. Raised in a world that demanded twice the effort for half the recognition, she learned early that silence was never an option. Where others yielded to intimidation, she sharpened her voice. Where others accepted dismissal, she pressed harder. That resilience became her compass. Her words carried echoes of her roots. In the church pews, in crowded classrooms, in neighborhoods overlooked by power, she discovered the strength of speaking when others couldn't. Those early battles shaped her cadence, sharp, deliberate, unafraid. It wasn't polish that made her compelling. It was truth, raw and unfiltered, spoken with the clarity of someone who had lived the struggles she described. Law became her battleground before politics did. She entered the courtroom armed with facts, fire, and a refusal to bend. Every case carried the weight of someone unseen. Every ruling felt like a statement about dignity itself. And when the odds stacked high, she didn't flinch. She confronted them, knowing that courage was contagious. That reputation followed her into the halls of power. Every debate scar was a medal. Every dismissal only fueled her resolve. She was not the heir of dynasties, or the product of political grooming. She was an outsider who carved her path with grit, intellect, and sheer authenticity. Each time a door closed, she broke through another. Each time she was told to wait her turn, she chose to fight instead. In Congress, she carried that same defiance. She didn't speak for herself, she spoke for millions. Her voice became the instrument of those who had been silenced, her questions the echo of citizens demanding answers. She was relentless, but never reckless. Sharp, but never cruel. Her dignity stood as her weapon, stronger than cynicism, sharper than arrogance. Crockett embodied the underdog spirit. She knew the chamber was stacked against her, allies scarce, critics plentiful, traditions designed to keep new voices in check. Yet she thrived in that tension. Every stare meant to belittle her became fuel. Every whisper of doubt became proof she was on the right path. And with each exchange, she grew sharper, more unshakable, more dangerous to the arrogance of the establishment. Her rise was not meteoric, but deliberate. Step by step, fight by fight, she built credibility not from spectacle but from substance. Voters saw in her a mirror of their own frustrations, a leader unafraid to cut through the noise. Her speeches weren't crafted to please. They were carved to pierce. Her pauses weren't hesitation. They were strategy. Each one reminding the room that silence could belong to the people, not just to power. And so, when Clarence Thomas interrupted her, it was not just a clash of personalities. It was a collision of histories. A man defined by silences, wielding authority to dismiss. A woman defined by her voice, wielding dignity to confront. The imbalance of power in that chamber was real, but so was the weight of her resolve. She carried with her every scar of past debates, every voice that had been left out of the conversation, every citizen who feared their truth would never be heard. In her defiance, there was empathy. In her clarity, there was courage. And in her fight, there was hope, the hope that dignity could still cut through corruption, that truth could still silence arrogance. And now, for the first time, that fight would be tested in the most dangerous silence of her career. The interruption wasn't the end, it was the ignition. What began as a single voice cutting across Jasmine Crockett's words erupted into a duel of authority. She steadied her papers, lifted her eyes, and attempted to continue. But Thomas pressed again, his tone sharper, his presence looming. It wasn't dialogue. It was dominance. The chamber bristled. Each word cut closer to the bone. His dismissal carried weight, not because of volume, but because of what it represented, decades of hierarchy pressing down on a single moment. Crockett's calm voice returned, deliberate, unbroken, her cadence resisting every attempt to cage it. Yet with every interruption, the air grew sharp, metallic. The tension tightened like wires drawn across stone. Some officials exchanged glances, wary of the spectacle unfolding. Whispers flickered in the gallery like sparks. Was this procedural? Or was it something darker, an effort to silence, to remind her of her place? Crockett knew the stakes. A single stumble would be amplified, dissected, replayed. But surrender was not an option. If you would allow me to finish. Her words rang steady, each syllable intentional. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Thomas leaned again, the weight of authority pressing like a gavel over her sentence. But this time, the murmurs grew louder. Some shifted uneasily in their seats. Others leaned forward, captivated. It was no longer a simple exchange. It was a standoff, and the chamber itself seemed to sense the breaking point. Every second tightened like a noose. Crockett's restraint became its own act of defiance. She did not raise her voice, did not match interruption with chaos. She waited. She let the arrogance reveal itself. And with each moment he pressed harder, his authority seemed less like confidence, more like fear of losing control. The tension became unbearable. The chamber walls, tall and cold, seemed to lean inward, as though history itself wanted to see how this would end. Crockett adjusted her stance, her eyes unwavering. The duel of words had reached its peak. The silence between them now carried the weight of a nation watching. And then, with the entire chamber leaning forward, she struck back. Her voice didn't rise, it sharpened, like steel drawn from its sheath. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout to command the chamber. She needed only precision, and each word landed with surgical force. The interruption had been meant to diminish her. Instead, it became the stage for her fire. She leaned slightly forward, steadying herself, eyes fixed on Clarence Thomas. Her tone was calm, but beneath that calmness burned fury tempered into logic. You may interrupt me, but you cannot erase the truth. The chamber gasped. It wasn't loud, but it rippled, like glass cracking under heat. Crockett continued, her cadence unwavering, her voice slicing through the air. Every syllable cracked through arrogance. She laid out hypocrisy with precision. She spoke of decisions cloaked in authority but riddled with contradictions. She recalled rulings that fractured public trust. She demanded accountability, not with pleading, but with icy clarity. You speak of order, yet your silence on corruption is louder than any words. Every camera captured history. The image was unmistakable, a woman standing calm against the weight of dismissal, her words reframing the entire confrontation. What had been framed as arrogance now looked like weakness. Thomas's interruption, once a display of dominance, became evidence of fragility. The silence became applause, not literal clapping, but the unmistakable shift in the chamber. Officials leaned in, eyes wide, caught in the gravity of her defiance. For the first time that night, Thomas didn't press. His pause, once a weapon, now became a retreat. Crockett pressed further, weaving logic into fire. Her voice turned interruption into indictment. Each phrase mirrored the people's frustration, their demand for dignity and power. She wasn't just defending herself, she was holding the institution accountable. This chamber does not belong to arrogance. It belongs to the people. The words thundered without volume. The chamber seemed to tilt toward her, as though history itself leaned forward to listen. And beyond those walls, validation surged. Within an hour the clip exploded, #Rule of Law trended nationwide. Millions shared the footage. Commentators dissected her precision. Supporters framed her as the voice America needed in a time of disillusionment. Even critics admitted the exchange could not be ignored. What was meant to silence had instead amplified her to the nation. The power shift was unmistakable. Arrogance, once the hammer in the room, was now exposed as brittle. Dignity, wielded with calm ferocity, had become the louder force. The chamber was no longer Thomas's domain. In that moment, it belonged to Crockett. Her words didn't just challenge authority, they reminded the nation why truth matters. They showed that even in the most hostile chambers, dignity can cut sharper than any gavel. The interruption that threatened to erase her had instead become her defining hour. The silence stretched again, but this time it was not dangerous. It was reverent. Every breath felt like witness. The chamber had heard not only a rebuttal, but a reckoning. And still, Crockett stood poised, unflinching, her presence radiating the certainty of someone who knew she had already changed the balance. But if her words struck like lightning, the aftermath would roar like thunder. By dawn, the chamber's silence had become the nation's roar. What had begun as a single interruption now echoed across America, amplified by every screen, every share, every conversation. The moment could no longer be contained within marble walls. The chamber itself remained stunned in the hours after. Some officials whispered in corners, their voices low but urgent. Others stared at the floor, unwilling to meet eyes. The usual pomp of authority had fractured. Crockett's calm defiance had redrawn the balance of power, at least for that night. Outside, the shockwaves spread. Tweets fired like gunpowder. Hashtags ignited. Screens glowed with replay after replay. Clips hit 10 million views overnight. Every angle, every word was dissected, praised, and weaponized. What seemed a minor disruption had transformed into a national reckoning. Every headline carried her name. Some called it the night dignity struck back. Others painted it as a fracture in the silence of power. On talk shows, analysts debated whether Crockett had merely embarrassed Thomas or cracked something deeper, the facade of untouchable authority. Allies rallied with pride. Progressive leaders hailed her as a symbol of accountability in an era of cynicism. Activists replayed her words at rallies, her phrases turned into chants. For millions, she became not just a representative, but a voice of vindication, proof that arrogance could be challenged and dignity could win. Critics scrambled. Defenders of the establishment dismissed the exchange as grandstanding, an overblown moment in a routine session. But their words rang hollow, drowned beneath the tidal wave of social validation. What they dismissed as theater, the people embraced as truth. And Thomas? His silence became its own headline. The man once feared for his authority now seemed diminished, his power dented by the clarity of a single response. Every pause of his career, once seen as calculated, now looked evasive. Where he once wielded silence as strength, now it read as retreat. Power shifted in whispers and screens. Staffers murmured about a new energy sweeping the chamber. Commentators suggested that Crockett's moment could mark a turning point, not only for her career but for the broader struggle over legitimacy in American institutions. And in homes across the country, people felt something rare: hope. Hope that arrogance could be checked. Hope that the voices dismissed as unqualified or unworthy could still rise. Hope that words, sharp, steady, unflinching, could reverberate louder than gavel strikes. By dawn, the chamber's silence was no longer dangerous. It was momentum. But what does a roar mean if the system still resists? When the echoes faded, only one truth remained: dignity doesn't bow. The clash that had begun with arrogance and interruption ended not with fury, but with resolve. Crockett's calm defiance turned the chamber into a mirror, reflecting what power feared most: truth spoken without fear. The noise dissolved into clarity. Where shouts and gavel strikes once tried to dominate, her steady cadence outlasted them all. Every truth stood taller than lies. Every pause carried more weight than an interruption. She had shown, before the eyes of a nation, that strength isn't measured in volume but in the courage to stand unshaken. Her silence spoke louder than power. In the stillness that followed, the chamber carried a new awareness. Authority can dismiss. It can interrupt. It can attempt to silence. But it cannot erase resolve. Crockett proved that legitimacy is not granted by titles or tenure. It is earned through dignity that refuses to bend. Across the country, that lesson resonated. Parents replayed the clip for their children, teaching them that courage doesn't mean shouting over others. It means refusing to be moved when the world tries to silence you. Students quoted her lines in classrooms, turning her defense into declarations of their own. The ripple became a current, pulling dignity back into the national conversation. And yet, the chamber itself reminded everyone of the stakes. The rule of law is fragile. Trust in institutions hangs by threads easily frayed. One exchange cannot heal decades of distrust, but it can plant a seed. Crockett's words became that seed, proof that even in the face of arrogance, one steady voice can shift the ground beneath giants. This was not a victory of theatrics. It was a victory of principle. She reminded the nation that the fight for justice is not won in grand gestures, but in the small, defiant acts of refusing to yield. The cameras captured history, but history will remember the dignity. And yet, the struggle for that dignity has only just begun. This was no ordinary debate, it was a warning shot. The chamber emptied, but the tension lingered, echoing in the minds of every witness. What unfolded was a dramatization, yet its lesson is real: courage, dignity, and truth can prevail even in the most intimidating arenas. Fade to silence. The gavel echoes one last time, a reminder that power can interrupt, but it cannot erase integrity. Across screens, across cities, across conversations, her stand reverberates, proof that one voice, unwavering, can ignite change. Darkness, then resolve. The story closes on a chamber that has seen arrogance confronted, a nation reminded of its own values, and a hero who refused to bow. Engage with this moment. Share it, discuss it, and carry its lesson forward. Stand for dignity. Speak your truth. Protect the courage that refuses to yield. The fight for dignity isn't over, and neither are we.